Good afternoon. I'm delighted to introduce Sai Prakash and celebrate his appointment to the D. Lurton Massee Jr. Professorship. Lurton Massee was a 1961 graduate of the law school and a partner in what was then Kilpatrick & Cody in Atlanta. He played an important role in creating the Albert C. Tate and the Elizabeth and Richard Merrill research professorships. The chair that bears his name was established with a gift from his estate after his death in 1993. In addition to his generosity to the law school, Lurton was an active supporter of the arts in Atlanta. Sai Prakash joined the faculty last academic year from the University of San Diego Law School, where he was the Herzog Research Professor. He is a graduate of Stanford University and the Yale Law School. After law school, he clerked for Judge Silberman on the D.C. Circuit, and then for Justice Thomas, where one of his co-clerks was our own Caleb Nelson. Sai began his academic career at the University of San Diego, at the University of Illinois, and then moved to Boston University before joining the San Diego faculty in 1999. While there, he attracted considerable admiration among our faculty, and after a lengthy courtship, we were able to persuade Sai and Rashmi to move to Charlottesville. Sai shares with another of his co-clerks, John Yoo, a deep interest in presidential powers, although so far Sai has managed to stay out of trouble with it. His articles, The President's Power to Execute the Laws, written with Stephen Calabrese, and The Executive Power Over Foreign Affairs, written with Michael Ramsey, and both published in the Yale Law Journal, are the canonical contemporary expressions of what one might call the mainstream pro-presidential position. They defend that position in the areas of domestic affairs and foreign relations, respectively. The first article argues that the president's possession of the executive power gives him substantial control over the administration of the government, and so is a leading defense of the unitary executive thesis. That thesis, explained most pithily by Justice Alito, holds that whatever the scope of the executive power may be, the president controls it. The second article has similarly become the standard defense of the position that the executive power, as it was understood at the time of the framing, brought with it substantial authority with respect to foreign relations that had been the king's. The articles are important both because of their content and because they represent the state-of-the-art application of the standard interpretive tools of text, structure, and history. The textual analysis is careful and sophisticated. The structural thinking is detailed and rests on a profound understanding of the way the entire constitutional system works, and the historical work is thorough and sensitive to the myriad challenges of interpretation of historical materials. Having written two foundational articles about executive authority, Sai more recently expanded his field of vision to issues touching on multiple threads of the constitutional fabric. The separation and overlap of war and military powers is an integrated account of presidential and congressional powers and of obvious current relevance. Removal and tenure in office is about another cross-cutting structural issue, removal powers. It too provides an integrated view of the topic and in so doing departs in some respects from pro-executive orthodoxy. For example, by finding a removal power for executive officers in Congress as well as in the President. With respect to removal of federal judges, Sai has provided the best available defense of the unorthodox, although venerable, position that Congress may provide for civil judicial proceedings to remove a judge for bad behavior, and thus that impeachment is not the exclusive means of removing federal judges. Sai's work thus confronts long-standing constitutional questions and examines them with the usual tools of textual, structural, and historical analysis. He simply does it better than the vast majority of constitutional scholars. John Harrison has provided an apt analogy, as he so often does. If you have a high 90s fastball and a wipeout curve, you don't need any trick pitches. I don't expect any trick pitches from Sai this afternoon, but I do look forward to seeing the high heat. Please welcome the D. Lurton Massee Jr. Professor of Law and Sullivan and Cromwell Research Professor, Sai Prakash.
Well, I want to thank Dean Mahoney for that very kind and undeserved introduction. I had the misfortune of playing Little League when I was a child once. And, I wasn't a pitcher and I wasn't a hitter. I think the only way I got on base is if I got hit by a ball. And they, of course, stuck me in the outfield. So you're not going to see high heat today. You're not going to see, you're going to see soft ball, soft pitch. You're not going to... I'm not, he's built me up too much, and I think I can only disappoint you. I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm very gratified and flattered that you took time out of your schedule to come here today. I'm sure many of you have come out of a sense of obligation, and I thank you nonetheless. I also want to thank the representatives of Meriwether Lewis Elementary who are here today. They blend in really well, so you might not be able to see them, but they are here lurking about. So the title of the talk is No More Kings. Several colleagues and students seem to like the title. I have told them that the title is the best part of the talk. By the end of the talk, several of you will agree. In any event, the title is a reference to a 1975 cartoon and song by Schoolhouse Rock, which has this refrain, No More Kings. The song describes how the colonists in America became estranged from George III and decided we were going to have a, quote, president and not have kings, right? So no more kings is the refrain. Of course, there's a slightly more famous item, the Declaration of Independence, that catalogs colonial grievances against the crown. Perhaps the Declaration suggests that those who wrote it likewise thought that there would and should be no more kings. Indeed, in the wake of independence, the state constitutions created at the state level really created a very narrow and weak set of executives. State executives were sometimes made plural, that is to say it was a council rather than an individual who was the executive. Many traditionally executive powers like appointment and pardon power were severely curtailed in various respects. And then finally, executives were often given very short terms and term limited, right? So some executives could only serve for a year and they couldn't serve again. When we turn to the Constitution, there seems nothing in it to suggest a turn to regal attitudes. The Constitution grants the president no regal title, no crown, no scepter, no throne, no robes. Naturally, most would read it as establishing a modest, holy Republican executive. The Constitution seems to ensure, in the words of the Schoolhouse Rock song, that there will be no more kings. My principal claim is that this understanding of the Constitution's executive is too simplistic. It is too simplistic for three reasons. First, it fails to consider what features or traits were common to monarchs in the 18th century. It fails to use those features and traits as a checklist in evaluating the 18th century presidency. And it fails to account for the many, many people who said that the president was a king in all but name. In other words, when someone quickly says the Constitution and the history that preceded it established that there would be no more kings, they have adopted too unsophisticated an approach to the question. So my conclusion, my friends, is that the fountain of knowledge, Schoolhouse Rock, may very well be wrong. Maybe Article 2 does create a monarchy of sorts, and maybe the president is a king of sorts. Now, I've got to say, to preface the rest of the talk, I was myself surprised about this because it's perceived wisdom that the Constitution doesn't create a monarchy. But I think to really evaluate the question, you need to ask what was a monarchy in the 18th century, and as I said earlier, line up the powers and features of the presidency and see where it fits. Certainly today, if we looked around at monarchs, we see monarchs of all different sorts, right? We see very powerful monarchs and see very weak monarchs. I think when we think about it today, several traits come to mind, right? Pomp and circumstance. We think of thrones, carriage rides, crowns, robes, scepters, and some might add bad teeth. Right, when we were, we had the good fortune of visiting England one summer or one spring day, and we saw the Queen go by in a carriage. And maybe for some people that might be the, what you think about when you think of a crown or a monarchy. Also, you might equate it with some degree of political power, right? Like the power to declare war, power to execute the laws, to pardon people, and to appoint officers. Life tenure seems to come to mind, right? Kings usually serve until they die or until they abdicate. They aren't term limited. They don't have terms of office. Another feature, hereditary succession, right? We think kings and queens are succeeded by their offspring or by near kin. And then another feature is singularity, that is to say unity. Monarchy is said to be a rule by one. But several of these traits are not necessary conditions of monarchy even today. Some modern monarchies are elective and not hereditary, right? The papacy, the king of Malaysia and the king of Cambodia, they're all elected. And the powers of monarchs obviously vary widely today. As I said earlier, some monarchs are mere figureheads. They don't actually have much power. They just occupy a ceremonial head of state position. Well, variations in monarchy were common in the 18th century as well. Monarchs of that era came in different guises. So one sort of monarch was the absolute monarch who ruled as a despot, someone we might call a dictator today. They had absolute authority to make laws, execute them, and adjudicate disputes. Another form of monarchy was a limited or constitutional monarchy. These monarchs lacked absolute powers, but tended to have certain executive and legislative powers. King George III, even though he was much derided and much castigated in the Declaration of Independence, was viewed as a limited or constitutional monarch because England, via a series of constitutional statutes or parliamentary statutes, had famously constrained the monarch's power in various ways. Although many tend to think of monarchy as always hereditary, there were then, as there are now, elective monarchs. Elective monarchs were usually drawn from a pool of select individuals and elected to serve for life. When an elective monarch died or abdicated, an electoral college would then select a new monarch. So the Holy Roman Emperor for a while was elected. That election became a formality as the title or as the office passed by hereditary means. The Polish king was selected from amongst nobles, with the electorate at one point reaching 50,000 electors. The Pope, who had greater temporal authority in the 18th century than he does today, was, of course, and still is, elected by a college of cardinals. Some people praise the system of elective monarchy. They understood that hereditary monarchies might run into problems when you had someone who was too young to be an effective monarch, or when you had someone who was ill-equipped to be an elective monarch. A hereditary monarch. Elective monarchs, in contrast, you had a situation where the electors could decide from a pool of candidates who would be the best fit or most fit to be the new monarchy. In fact, Blackstone in his commentaries praised the idea of a hereditary monarch. But the problem with electoral colleges is they were often subject to foreign influence and intrigue. Wisdom, knowledge, sound decision-making would often be subordinated to bribes and influence. So this was said to describe the Polish king's election over many successive elections, and some said it applied to the Pope's election as well. So while an elective monarchy could be better in theory, the real-world examples of elective monarchy left much to be desired. What about the other features and powers of the 18th century monarchs? There was no standard definition of what features and powers a monarchy had to have. But here are some typical features. Unity. It seems obvious that monarchies invariably had to have but one monarch. Indeed, executive unity was closely associated with monarchy. Unity was said to ensure that speed, secrecy, and energy necessary for executive tasks such as war-making and law execution were possible. But there were examples of dual monarchies. William and Mary jointly ruled England, and there were other monarchs in ancient history that also were dual monarchs. So even unity, even that function that we might just think you only have one monarch, that wasn't that clear in the 18th century. Immunity was another feature of the monarchy. Monarchs were usually immune from judicial process. The French Constitution of 1781 said that the person of the king, quote, is inviolable and sacred. And similar things were said of the English crown. Another feature was term for life and no impeachment. As a formal matter, monarchs served until they died or abdicated. If you had a tyrant or an addled fellow, too bad for you. But as a practical matter, nations did terminate their monarchs early, right? The English executed Charles I, and I suppose this was a form of life tenure. But he had a trial, right? So this was, in a sense, a form of impeachment in a way. He was tried first, found guilty, and then executed. Though the French spoke of their king as being sacred and inviolable, the 1791 Constitution also spoke of abdication, and they listed three types of abdication. One would be if he led the army against his people. The second category would be if he fled the kingdom without the Parliament's approval or the Assembly's approval. And the third category of abdication would be if he, quote, retracted his oath to the Constitution. So if he did any of those things, he could be punished for anything he did after the abdication as any private citizen could. So in a sense, you might think that they actually had some vision that, we're going to be able to punish our king if he does certain things wrong. So you might say the 1791 Constitution didn't provide for life tenure. Of course, Louis did lose his head, right? He also was executed as well. I don't know enough to know if they claimed it was pursuant to the Constitution or not. Another feature is, of course, this pomp and splendor. Monarchs were not associated with frugality. The 1791 French Constitution required that the Assembly provide for, quote, the splendor of the throne. What about the powers associated with the 18th century monarchy? Again, monarchs were said to be in charge of executing the laws, declaring war, making treaties, and granting pardons. But not all these powers were associated with every monarchy. The French king in 1791 could not declare war, could not make treaties, and could not grant pardons. The English king could make treaties, but he could not make those treaties the law of the land. He needed the assistance of Parliament. And though he could declare war, he always went to Parliament first because he needed the assistance of Parliament to fund his wars. It didn't make any sense for the king to declare war and find out after the fact that Parliament was unwilling to support it. So even though he had this formal power to declare war, in practice it was always exercised in conjunction with the Parliament, which is of course very similar to the system we have here today. So these variations in the forms and attributes of the monarchy help us understand better the shape of the monarchy in the 18th century. But to see why many regarded the presidency as a monarchy, we need to consider its creation and features. So we need to turn to the Philadelphia Convention and the aftermath of that convention. For our purposes, there are two interesting intertwined threads at the Constitutional Convention at Philadelphia: a purported popular fear and revulsion towards monarchy, coupled with the expansion of executive power over time. At the convention, the specter and promise of monarchy loomed in the background. Some insisted that the people would never stomach a monarchy or anything that smacked of it. Edmund Randolph of Virginia said that, quote, the permanent temper of the people was adverse to the very semblance of monarchy. Elbridge Gerry said that less than 1 in 1,000 Americans favored any move towards monarchy. Such delegates used the popular distaste of monarchy as a reason for vesting limited authority in a plural executive of the type found in some of the states. Randolph famously said that if we had a unitary executive, it would be, quote, the fetus of a monarchy. Another delegate said that a, quote, single magistrate will be an elective king and will feel the spirit of one, unquote. While we cannot say for sure, it seems fair to say that a majority of the convention delegates disfavored a monarchy, disfavored the idea of a monarchy. Nevertheless, some delegates had some kind words for the institution. One delegate said that, quote, a limited monarchy he considered as one of the best governments in the world. It was not certain that the same blessings were derivable from any other form of government. It was certain that equal blessings had never yet been derived from any of the republican forms of government. Another delegate put it this way: he was, quote, not so much afraid of the shadow of monarchy as to be unwilling to approach it, unquote. And another praised those with vigorous minds who had advocated a, quote, a high-toned monarchy, unquote, in the convention. So prevalent were such attitudes that one delegate claimed to have made a list listing 20 delegates whom he said favored a monarchy at the convention. Concerns about the monarchy were present in the convention throughout. Many people made arguments for or against a particular presidential power or executive power based on whether or not it would be considered to make the president a monarch. So some people said if we give this feature or power to the president, we're going to be making him a monarch. So some said if we give him the war power, he'd be a monarch. Some people said if he had an absolute veto, he'd be a monarch. Some people said if he appointed judges, he'd be a monarch. Others said, don't worry about all that. If we make him impeachable, he's not a monarch. The very fact of impeachment suggested he wasn't a monarch. Again, I suggest to you that these claims indicated the vagueness of the term monarch. There was just no set definition of it. Hamilton wanted to have a life term for the president, or for the executive more in particular, as compared to the 7-year term with no renewal provided for in a committee of the whole plan. And he anticipated an objection, right? He anticipated that some would say, you're just creating a monarch. And this is what he said. Quote, "It will be objected probably that such an executive will be an elective monarch and will give birth to the tumults which characterize that form of government." He was referring to papal elections and Polish elections. Hamilton replied that, quote, "Monarchy is an indefinite term. It marks not either the degree or the duration of the power. If his executive magistrate would be a monarch for a life, the one proposed by the Committee of Whole would be a monarch for 7 years." Right, so his point was, we're going to have a monarch either way, given the powers we're vesting in him. It doesn't matter how long the person's in office. In any event, with the creation of a single executive with more powers than originally thought possible, the stage was set for claims of monarchy. And indeed, Edmund Randolph, in the waning days of the convention, predicted that the people would behold the president and would find, quote, the form at least of a little monarch, unquote. Given the strong sense that the people would not stomach a monarchy, would not put up with it, why did the executive's powers mushroom over the course of the convention? What started off as a simple law enforcement officer, along with an appointer to offices under the Virginia plan, greatly expanded over time to include power over the military, a pardon power, foreign affairs powers, and a host of other authority. One can cite several factors as to why this occurred. First, there was always a sizable faction who wished to create a strong executive. These people held together as a coalition throughout the convention, and whenever they lost, they just reproposed something later on, right? They just never quit. They were indefatigable in their goal. To push their agenda, they made the argument that if we didn't create a strong executive, we would end up with a despot later on anyway. Because if the executive wasn't strong enough, the thought was the government wouldn't last long, and we'd have a Cromwell or some other dictator. Rather than having that, we should create a strong executive now. And I think the final reason was George Washington. Once it became clear that we were going to have one president and not a plural president, people who wanted to have a strong executive were able to use that in their favor, and people who were wary of the prospect let down their guard, right? They imagined that Washington was going to be this first president, this first executive, and they were perhaps more willing to countenance additional powers granted to the president. One delegate said after the fact, quote, "I do not believe that they, the executive powers, would have been so great had not many of the members cast their eyes towards General Washington as president and shaped their ideas of the powers to be given the president by their opinions of his virtue." In a sense, delegates voted to strengthen the presidency, recognizing that America's most illustrative and one of its most virtuous citizens would first occupy the office. In some measure, the office was tailor-made for the man. As Thomas Paine lamented years later, the executive part of the federal government was made for a man, and those who consented against their judgment to place executive power in the hands of a single individual reposed more on the supposed moderation of the person they had in view than on the wisdom of the measures themselves. So I've claimed that many regarded the Constitution as creating a monarchy, and I've suggested there were some statements in the Philadelphia Convention to that effect, certainly at the end of the convention. But the best test of this is not what was said at Philadelphia, but what was said after the fact, because of course the convention was a moving target. They were, crafting the Constitution as they went along. We need to look at what people said about the presidency after the convention to really see what people said about the finished product. What institutions did the presidency bring to mind? Well, the answer seemed obvious to some foreigners. After reading the Constitution in 1788, William V, the Dutch monarch, the stadtholder, told John Adams that Americans had given themselves, quote, a king under the title of president, unquote. What William V said seemed right to many Americans, for the president reminded many Americans of the British king. Why did they see the resemblance? Once again, the powers, commander-in-chief, treaty, appointments, pardons, the electoral college, which brought to mind the papacy and the Polish king, and the unity, right, the single monarch. It may not have been a requisite, a necessary feature of monarchies, but it sure reminded people of a monarch. Interestingly enough, one might even cite the title, president. President seems like a rather modest title, and I've always thought it to be such. And John Adams sneered at the title, right? In 1789, they were discussing whether the Senate and the House ought to address the president with a more high-sounding title. And Adams said, this is the title of used in firehouses and debating clubs. They have presidents. We need to have some, more fitting title for our president. He wanted to have a more high and mighty title. But if we delve into Samuel Johnson's dictionary, a dictionary of the era, we see a surprising entry for monarch. Samuel Johnson defined monarch as 1, a governor with absolute authority, semicolon, a king; 2, one superior to the rest of the same kind; and 3, president. In other words, citing Shakespeare for usage, Samuel Johnson considered president as a synonym for monarch. I was astounded by this. It never occurred to me that that would be the case. In any event, when we turn to what the Anti-Federalists said, they cited left and right the fact that the president would be a monarch. Those who attended the Constitutional Convention pull no punches. Luther Martin of Maryland said that the president was, quote, so constituted as to differ from monarchs scarcely but in name. Right? I guess he didn't have Samuel Johnson's dictionary in front of him. And that because he could be reelected without limit, the president was nearly the same thing as an elective monarch. His fellow dissenter, George Mason of Virginia, insisted that the presidency, quote, will be an elective monarchy, unquote. And other anti-federalists who weren't there at Philadelphia saw the same resemblance. Rhode Island never sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention. One person in Rhode Island, upon seeing the Constitution, said, see, we were justified because these crazy guys, they created an elective monarchy. And the person went on to say, this is the worst form of government, right? Citing Blackstone and citing the problems with elective monarchy. Another anti-federalist said he had, quote, clearly proven that the president is a king to all intents and purposes, and at the same time one of the most dangerous kinds, to an elective king. And to complete his uncontrolled sway, he is neither restrained nor assisted by a privy council, which is a novelty in government. I challenge the politicians of the whole continent to find in any period of history a monarch more absolute. He was referring to the fact that there was no council that constrained the president in all his actions, right? The only council that was provided for in the Constitution is the Senate, which only constrains his ability to make treaties and appointments, but he can pardon without consulting with anybody. He can do other things without consulting anybody. Most of his authorities can be exercised without consultation. Cato, an anti-federalist, said that the president possessed the powers of a monarch, and he said, wherein does this president, invested with his powers and prerogatives, essentially differ from the King of Great Britain, save as to name, the creation of nobility, and a few other unimportant powers? An old Whig, another anti-federalist, insisted that the president, quote, is in reality to be a king as much as the King of Great Britain, and a king, too, of the worst kind, an elective king. Right? Over and over again, the claim is, you have created an elective monarchy. That's what the Electoral College does. Right? You coupled this power of a monarch with the Electoral College, and that's why it's an elective monarchy. Patrick Henry, that famous Virginian, exclaimed that, quote, this Constitution is said to have beautiful features, but when I come to examine these features, sir, they appear to me to be frightful. Among other deformities, it has an awful squinting. It squints towards monarchy. And does this not raise indignation in the breast of every true American? Even Americans overseas saw the resemblance. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson said, the president, quote, seems a bad edition of a Polish king. This was a really bad insult because, as I said earlier, people thought that the election of the Polish king made him a stooge of foreign powers. William Short, his advisor or his aide in France, said the Constitution would convert, quote, the 13 republics into one mixed monarchy. For notwithstanding the humble title of president, he will have greater powers than several monarchs have. Unquote. The Constitution, said Short, showed that people had made large strides, quote, towards a toleration of monarchical principles, a larger stride than many would have thought possible during the Revolution. So he was shocked that this Constitution had resulted from the Philadelphia Convention, given the revulsion towards monarchy that he thought was prevalent in America. Federalists, of course, denied that the Constitution had created a king, but their claims were rather troubled. As historian Max Ferrand wrote, the supporters of the new order were at a loss to defend their Constitution and their contention that no monarchy had been established. Some just utterly denied any resemblance. John Marshall insisted that Federalists, those who supported the Constitution, quote, idolized democracy. We prefer this system to any monarchy. Right? It just denied that there was any monarchical aspects to the Constitution. Others made comments that actually seemed to concede some resemblance to a monarchy. One said that the system would not trigger the problems associated with Polish and papal elections, a claim that seemed to concede a slight resemblance. Another said that the president was given vast powers and was meant to be respectable in foreign eyes, but that everyone at Philadelphia had wished to prevent despotism and, quote, absolute monarchy, a statement once again that suggested perhaps that maybe the problem was absolute monarchy and not an elective, limited constitutional monarchy. In the Federalist Papers, Hamilton famously denied that the president would have the powers of a monarch, or the English monarch in particular, but he actually inflated the crown's powers at the time. It wasn't an accurate description of what the crown had. He did not compare the presidents to other monarchs of the era, nor did he deny that the president would have powers that certain monarchs lacked. Hamilton's discussion in the New York Convention, I think, was more sophisticated and more honest. He noted that there was great confusion as to what constituted a republic and what constituted a monarchy. He said that he noted that a lot of countries deemed republics actually had monarchs, right? So he said both England and Poland were deemed republics because they had limited their monarchs in various respects, but nonetheless they had monarchs while being deemed republics. Hamilton's observation, which harkened back to his claim at Philadelphia, raised interesting possibilities. While Benjamin Franklin was famously quoted as saying at the close of the Philadelphia Convention that the convention had created a republic rather than a monarchy, the truth was that the Constitution had features of both monarchy and republic, and republics, right? So one American, I think, put it best. He said, I doubt whether the Constitution has monarchy enough for it. He said, I doubt whether the Constitution has monarchy enough in it for some of our Massachusetts men or democracy enough for others. He was implying that it had some features that were monarchical and some that were democratic or republican. After ratification, it became less common to advert to or refer to the monarchical features of the Constitution. Americans were sort of stuck with the presidency for the time being, and anyone who thought about the comparison perhaps thought it impolitic to harp on what many would regard as a perceived flaw in the Constitution. When Noah Webster in 1791 observed that the French monarch, created by the 1791 French Constitution, had less authority than the president, his comment was appropriate because he was criticizing the 1791 Constitution and not criticizing the American Constitution. For many, an honest comparison to monarchy was only possible when the presidency was not the subject matter of the comparison. Others, however, lacked this inhibition, right? They were willing to make this comparison. John Adams was one such person. In a letter to Roger Sherman in 1789, he insisted that America had, quote, and this is while he's vice president, right? So maybe he's envisioning himself as the king one day. John Adams insisted that America had, quote, a monarchical republic, or if you will, a limited monarchy. The president's power during those 4 years is much greater than a king of Poland, nay, than a king of Sparta. I know of no first magistrate in any republican government, excepting the king of England and the king of Neuchâtel, which I think is part of Switzerland, who possesses a constitutional dignity, authority, and power comparable to the president's. He further claimed that the president's, quote, rights and duties are so transcendent, quote, that they must naturally and necessarily excite in the nation all of the jealousy, envy, apprehensions, and oppositions that are so constantly observed in England against the crown. Besides Adams, foreigners routinely referred to America as having established a monarch, particularly Englishmen. Right? And you might think this is because they thought, we had copied them in some way. Maybe they were flattered by the copy, but by us copying their institutions. But they did say this, right? So one Englishman predicted that the, quote, crown of America would eventually move from an elective system to a hereditary one. Another confirmed Adams claim that the Polish king had less executive power than, quote, the King of England and the officer who without the name discharges the functions of a king in America. And a third said that both Poland and America were, strictly speaking, elective monarchies, albeit with different terms of office. One Englishman who denounced monarchy in all its forms wrote a chapter entitled "A President with Regal Powers." He obviously was aware that monarchy could take many shapes and guises and hide behind seemingly innocent titles. He warned against being seduced by the idea of an executive elected for a term, albeit with monarchical prerogatives. He then listed appointments, pardons, and vetoing as among a king's functions, and noted that the U.S. president had such authority. Post-1789, most Americans weren't as concerned about whether they had a king or not. The categorization of the classifications didn't matter. They were on to more practical matters. In practice, some of these practical matters dealt with executive authority or executive forms, and there were various fights about whether the presidency should have so-called high-toned features, pomp and circumstance, let's call it that. Right? The Constitution neither required nor forbade pomp and honor for the president. Some people insisted we should have these regal customs, and others said we couldn't because of our Constitution. So I'll list 5 different things here. For instance, the president's address before Congress, complete with responses from both chambers, was said by critics to replicate the annual address of the English crown from the throne. One senator objected, referring to the president's speech as, quote, his gracious speech, saying that aped a British practice, right? In England, they called the Crown's speech his grace's speech. Some members of the Senate wanted to call the speech the same in America, and this guy said, "You can't do that. We don't have a monarch, or we shouldn't be aping that practice." The president also held fancy levees or parties at his home, parties that led critics to speak of the president holding, quote, court. They featured elaborate dress, deep bows, stilted conversations, and awkward silences. Washington refused to shake people's hands, right, maintaining a regal distance. One senator grumbled that this practice was, quote, considered as a feature of royalty. It is certainly anti-Republican. This escapes nobody. The royalists glory in it as a point gained, as if they had proven that we had a monarchical system by having these parties. He, of course, attended these levees, notwithstanding his concerns. As I mentioned earlier, there was debate in the Senate and the House about whether the president should be given a title whenever the House or the Senate addressed the president. And the Senate in particular debated whether the president should be known as His Highness, the President of the United States, and protector of their liberties. Such titles were opposed precisely because they smacked of monarchy. Another matter. The Senate wished to have judicial process issued in the president's name, just as process issued in the king's name in England. The senators who wished that lost the battle but won the war. They lost the battle because they couldn't get that past Congress in the Process Act, but the judiciary voluntarily agreed to use the president's name in their process. So the president's name was used to summon people, order courts around, etc., even though he had nothing to do with that. Right? The president wasn't actually filling out these forms. It was judicial officers and judges filling them out, but they used the president's name because they perhaps thought that's the way things were done in England, and they thought perhaps they should be done the same way here. And then the final example I'll give is the enactment clause, or the enacting clause of legislation. Right? Today, if you look at an enacting clause, it says the Senate and the House enact the following law. Well, some people in the Senate thought it should mention the president as well. After all, the bills are presented to the Senate. The president, as well as, it goes to the Senate and the president and the House, not just the Senate and the House. And they failed in this, right? And it was opposed on grounds that this would mimic English style again. It never came to a vote. These skirmishes over form highlighted the Constitution's monarchical features. Jefferson, in a moment of candor, said that a Constitution, quote, like ours, wears mixed aspects of monarchy and republicanism, Naturally, some would wish to strengthen the monarchical aspects and others the Republican. As Jefferson put it, some will consider the Constitution a monarchy, an elective monarchy, and others will view it as an energetic republic. 2 centuries later, we still struggle with this dispute today, with some wishing to exalt the presidency and others wishing to equate him to an ordinary citizen. In conclusion, I've taken more than enough of your time. The president was considered to be an elective monarch by many and was thought to have powers rivaling and in some cases exceeding the powers granted to European monarchs. What implication does this history have for us today? Are we supposed to refer to the president as high mightiness? Are we supposed to bow, kiss his ring, or support a lavish lifestyle? Does the president have regal powers hitherto obscured? Well, for those who think early history matters little or not at all this history is purely academic, right? They won't matter to them in a bit, and it shouldn't, right, given their theory of constitutional interpretation. But even those for whom history matters quite a bit, I want to suggest that the implications of this history are rather modest. I don't think this history suggests that the president has or should have additional powers just because many regarded the president as being a monarch at the time. It was the powers and features of the presidency found in Article 2 that led people to think that the president was a monarch. That is to say, they looked at the Constitution and said, you know what, this brings to mind a monarchy. They didn't say, we think we've created a monarch independent of the things found in the Constitution. For instance, no one said the president should have a title because he was a monarch. And no one said the president should be able to remove officers because he was a king. Having said this, I suppose this history does cast grave doubt on the common argument that the president should not be understood to have a particular power over officers or over foreign affairs or over any other subject matter because the framers were uniformly opposed to a monarchy and did not create one. But it doesn't mean that any particular argument is wrong. It just means that this particular argument might not be the best reason for why the president does or does not have particular power. Second, I would say one implication of this research is that the Constitution virtually guarantees that those opposed to presidential assertions of power will naturally and inevitably exclaim monarchy whenever they don't like what the president's done. Such claims are an inevitable part of our constitutional discourse. The Constitution virtually invites them. If such claims were made even in the absence of a president, of course they're going to be made in the presence of a flesh and blood president who seems to have exceeded his powers. In short, I want to suggest that the Constitution itself may have established what Arthur Schlesinger called an imperial presidency. Thank you for your patience. That's all I have to say.